Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlik here. So we made a separate video talking about late last week the Trump administration announced they are temporarily pausing some sanctions on Russian oil. As a result of the crisis, the energy crisis brought about by the Iranian conflict, we know that the price of oil has skyrocketed. The price of energy has skyrocketed. And there's another aspect that some newspapers are reporting on today that I thought was worth making a video on. So, one of maybe an expected economic consequence of the current Iran conflict is that Russia itself is suddenly earning much more money from oil exports than they were even 3 weeks ago. So, according to estimates reported by the Financial Times, Russia is earning up to $150 million per day in additional budget revenue from simply higher oil prices triggered by the crisis in the Middle East. So the Financial Times is reporting that in just the first 12 days of the conflict, Moscow likely gained between 1.3 and 1.9 billion dollars in extra oil tax revenue. And analysts estimate that number could skyrocket or could reach between 3 and 5 billion dollars by the end of the month if prices remain where they're at, if the price of energy remains where it's at. So, we talked about this a bit in other videos, but why is this happening? The first reason is pretty simple. Wars in major oil producing regions tend to push global energy prices up. Key issue of this is we talked about it in a previous video, the Strait of Hormuz, which is this narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply normally passes. We know the Iranians have said that the strait is closed. So when conflict threatens that shipping in the region, oil traders anticipate supply disruptions. Maybe there are really supply disruptions. And so as a result, global oil prices rise quickly. For Russia, that matters enormously. As we know, oil and gas remain one of the core, if not the core, Russians' keys to Russia's budget. So before the crisis, Russia's crude oil was selling for roughly $52 per barrel. During the conflict in Iran, prices have jumped closer to $70 to $82 per barrel. So even if Russia exports roughly the same amount of oil and there's not an increase, which we suspect there's going to be an increase again with the lifting of sanctions, some sanctions late last week, higher prices mean significantly higher revenue for the Kremlin. So there's also the issue of that buyers are turning to Russia to replace supply that is being lost due to the Iranian conflict. With the Middle East, oil shipments being disrupted, countries that historically or contemporary have depended on importing energy from the Middle East, especially India, especially China, have increased their purchase of Russia crude. So these two countries were already large buyers of Russian oil. Even after the sanctions were put in place in 2022. But now, with the conflict, with the instability in the Persian Gulf, Russian oil becomes even more attractive. Importers, we know, want reliable supply that does not pass through the Strait of Hormuz, does not get impacted by the conflict in the Middle East, and Russia can fill that void through pipelines, through shipments through the Black Sea, and transport through the Bosphorus. So, in other words, Russia's oil exports are less exposed to the main geopolitical choke point in the Middle East. So, we have two things happening at the same time. The price of energy is going up, which benefits Russia, and then more people are turning to Russian energy because it is viewed as more reliable. So we can see how much money the Russian administration, the Kremlin, is making just in the first few weeks of the conflict. So something to keep in mind as the Ukraine-Russia conflict probably isn't going to be on the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times over the next few days, as the conflict in Iran continues to take much of our attention. If we dig a little deeper, we can see how this geopolitical conflict is benefiting Russia. And then what does that mean for the peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? It could make peace harder to find, as Russia now is receiving more money than they were just a few weeks ago. Okay, thank you.